Welcome back to the third part of our lecture on the provisional government and the rise of the Soviet. Well, now that we know who the provisional government is and who the Soviet is, we need to have a think about who is actually holding the power. So we understand that a dual authority is existing. But as time goes on in 1917, who is actually exercising the power? Who has the real authority in Russia? We want to understand this Petrograd Soviet. It's really important to understand where the Soviet is getting its authority from. Remember, it's getting its authority from its members, those that it represents. People like the Kronstadt sailors. Here we can see a meeting where there's discussion going on. So we get this in the soldier groups, amongst the sailors. They are the ones agitating for reform. Also within the factories, people who are passionate, wanting to be involved, wanting to have a say in this new country. That's what the February Revolution had been about. And it's these people who are sending their representatives off to the Petrograd Soviet. And it's these people who are basically running the country. Because without the support of your postal workers and your rail workers and your factories and your soldiers and your sailors, you can't control the country. And what we want to understand is that this idea of participation means that the idea of the Soviet spreads very quickly. And so while we have the Petrograd Soviet established first, very quickly after, we have others. This is a picture of the Tiflis Soviet. Tiflis is in Georgia, in the wider Russian Empire. And just having a look at this picture gives you a feel for who might be in the Soviet. There's a lot of military uniforms here, but also non-military civilians. Some of these would be, of course, almost professional revolutionaries, people who had been part of revolutionary political parties in the past. So while we start with the Petrograd Soviet, very quickly, we see another Soviet in Moscow, again representing all those different people and just representing the workers and the soldiers and the sailors. And then we see one in Kiev, and then we see them proliferating all around the major places across the Russian and many more. What we've got by June 1917, we already have more than 300 different Soviets across Russia. By October 1917, we have more than 900 different Soviets. And so as this idea of the Soviets spread, what we see is the development of a new level of the Soviet. So each of these 300 going to 900 different Soviets elects representatives and sends them off to the Congress of Soviets. The first All-Russian Congress of Soviets meets in June 1917, and it had 820 delegates. This is a picture of the first meeting of the Congress of Soviets, and just outlining there, highlighting a couple of key Bolsheviks, and we'll come back to these particular people later on. But your Congress of Soviets involves quite often your more professional politicians, members of your Mensheviks and your socialist revolutionaries, and some Bolsheviks in there as well. But again, they are representing the people who put them there. And so this is seen as a very democratic institution that is developing. So who really had control? The provisional government, as we know, had introduced reforms, very welcomed reforms, dismantling controls that had been put in place by the Tsarist government. We are now in the freest country in the world. The Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, had been disbanded. Regulatory controls on dissidents had gone. There's freedom of the press. There's no more arresting somebody because they are opposing the government. This is a time where people are encouraged to discuss, to debate what the future will be. However, when you introduce such freedom, you can also bring an element of chaos. And the Tsarist bureaucracy, that vast number of government officials who had operated so efficiently under the Tsar's regime, they ceased to function. And when they cease to function, when they cease to, make the payments that went to veterans, when they cease to ensure that communications are spreading across the country, then the whole government, the whole country stops functioning. At the same time, the cities and the government were falling apart. Even though the provisional government was promising change, a lot of the pressures that had been there, that had forced the February Revolution, people were hungry. People were still dying on the front line. Those things had not changed. And out in the countryside, agrarian anarchy is still running very high as the peasants are seizing the land from the landlords. By that stage, the police aren't protecting the landlords. They understand that the revolution is happening. And the landlords were no longer undertaking their responsibilities to look after the peasants, to make sure that, the harvests are being completed properly. And so everything is falling apart. The provisional government wanted discussion. They wanted to make compromise. This was the idea of them, reflecting these new liberal democratic ideals that they want to promote. Now, this is ideologically sound. So this is an ideologically sound approach, but it actually results in not doing much. If you're trying to please everybody, you actually don't operate very effectively. The peasants were continuing, all they wanted was land reform, and they were just taking the opportunity to seize the land as they went. Historian David Christian talks about this idea that the provisional government was actually not able to operate effectively, and he's suggesting that the provisional government actually alienated its supporters. It was trying to introduce policies that aimed at pleasing both its upper class, moderate supporters and the supporters of the Soviet, because they understood how much effective, real power the Soviet had. And as Christian puts it, the result was to alienate both groups. Who's supporting the provisional government now? Bruce Lockhart was there. He's a British secret agent, a British agent operating in Russia at the time. He was actually a good friend of Kerensky. And he wrote in his memoirs, which he published in 1932, that really neither the Duma nor the intelligentsia, the intellectuals, really had any control of the situation in February. So he's understanding the February Revolution had been a revolution of the people. And it was really going to take the group that is able to meet the needs of the people to get their support. And we have to question whether the provisional government is doing that effectively in 1917. Here's another indication of how little support the provisional government had. A letter written by Alexander Guchkov. He was the Minister for War. He was in the provisional government. And as early as 22nd of March 1917, they've only been in office for less than a month. But in that letter, Guchkov admits that the provisional government's got no real power. And it's the Soviet, in fact, that held the most important elements of actual power, such as troops, railroads, postal and telegraph service. As early as March 1917, the provisional government understands that actual power is lying with the Soviet. As time goes on, things are not getting better for the provisional government. And there's a stronger feeling within the Soviet itself that it needs to take a stronger role, not just let the provisional government go and they'll countersign, but the Soviet actually needs to step up and have more input in what the provisional government is doing. And therefore there is agitation, pressure put on the provisional government. There's a change of membership and a few more socialists added to the provisional government. Kerensky, our friend Alexander Kerensky here, becomes the Minister for War, a key position, still maintaining that commitment to the Allies and the commitment to the war. But Kerensky now has a more authoritative position, a greater position of power. He tries to promote enthusiasm, trying to sell the armies. This isn't the old Tsarist army anymore. This is the new Russian army, the People's Army. And he tries to get people behind the war effort again. And he has some success in reinvigorating some support, although people are still hungry. What he does in June 1917 is launches a new offensive on the front line. It's called the Kerensky Offensive. It takes place down here on this part of the line, which had been fairly quiet to that point. And he launches it in the hope of getting a victory and reinvigorating more support for the Russian war effort. What happens, however, is the offensive fails. And by July, you can see the Germans have pushed back and the Russians have lost even more territory. This is a disaster. What we've got to understand is that by July 1917, the Provisional Government is struggling to maintain control of Russia. Protests increase, strikes increase. The people are still hungry. And with the failure of the Kerensky Offensive, we're starting to get even more desertions from the front line. The Provisional Government is really struggling to maintain its authority and get anything done in Russia to actually support the people, to fulfill any of its ambitions. In the meantime, the Soviet, representing the workers, the soldiers, the sailors, they seem to be gaining more and more support and wanting to increase, to step up its role. And that's where we'll leave that introduction to understanding who's filling the power vacuum that was left by the Tsar's resignation in February 1917. And we need to understand now what is going to happen as 1917 continues.